And this just really was the beginning of what became probably the most repressive period since the dictatorships. I mean, this month of November was the second deadliest month since Bolivia became a democracy about 40 years ago in terms of state forces killing people. And then it just went on this rampage. They started arresting people who spoke out against the government. They were charged with terrorism or sedition. They would shut down indigenous radio stations. If you were a journalist from one of the commercial stations and were outspoken about the government, you were charged with sedition or terrorism. I spent most of the year, much of this time in jail with folks, interviewing them.
This program is brought to you by Haymarket Books as part of our live event series. Haymarket Books is a radical, independent publisher dedicated to connecting social movements with the ideas they need in the struggle for a better world. You can help support the Haymarket Project by buying books at haymarketbooks.org, and especially by joining the Haymarket Book Club. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast and the Haymarket YouTube channel to access all of our upcoming events.
Well, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Jim Cavallaro, and I am the Executive Director of the University Network for Human Rights. I'm really happy and excited to be here for this book launch. This is the book. I know you've got other visuals of this book, and we're releasing it. We have with us both Linda Farthing and Thomas Becker. And let me start by presenting the two of them, and then we'll get right into a discussion with the two authors about this book, about why they wrote it, about what's in it, and why it's important for this hemisphere. But let me start with Linda Farthing, who's got a really impressive background, as does Thomas Becker. Linda Farthing is a journalist and independent scholar who reported and commented from Bolivia in real time during the 2019-2020 coup for The Guardian, The Economist, Al Jazeera, America's Quarterly, NPR, and the BBC. So she was there in real time. She has worked in community development projects. She has taught and written about Bolivia since the 1980s. She has worked on 3 documentaries on topics in Latin America and has edited 9 books. She is also the co-author of 3 previous books on Bolivia, in addition to this book, which is excellent, as you will see. And those books were Evo's Bolivia, Continuity and Change, From the Mines to the Streets, A Bolivian's Activist's Life, and Impasse in Bolivia, Neoliberal Hegemony and Popular Resistance. So we're thrilled to have Linda with us. Let me just flag that she's had some internet issues. I think she'll be on, at least initially, just on voice without an image, so we make sure that we can hear her comments, answers, and analysis of this text. Now let me introduce, if I can, Thomas Becker. He's a senior clinical advisor and attorney at the University Network for Human Rights. Spent most of the past 15 years working with social movements in Bolivia. He was the driving force between the first successful U.S. case against an ex-head of state, Mamani versus Sanchez de Rosada, which held Bolivia's former president responsible for the massacre of indigenous protesters. 2019 to 2020, he documented abuses in Bolivia by the Áñez regime for the University Network for Human Rights and Harvard Law School, where he has taught for a number of years. He has also worked on human rights issues with Adawasis in India, with Sahrawis in Western Sahara, in Lebanon, Palestine, Honduras, Colombia, and in Chiapas. When he's not practicing law and advocating for human rights, he's an award-winning musician and songwriter who has recorded with Grammy-winning producers and toured throughout the world as a drummer and guitarist. And he's also a mountain climber who has summited peaks, including Mount Everest. So 2 very impressive, talented folks that you're going to hear from. And what we're going to hear about is this book. And let me start. I'm going to flip a few questions. I'm going to start with the question, the title, coup, because you don't mince words with the title. A lot of folks dance around this issue and talk about a change in governance or regime change. Some accepted a narrative, and I'd like to ask you about this narrative, that, oh no, this wasn't a coup. This was a response to alleged electoral fraud, and it was a popular transition. Why do you call it a coup? Tell us what the case is for a coup, and tell us what's wrong in the narrative that many still advance that there was electoral fraud and that the transition was legitimate. Tell me why that's not the case. Again, I have my own views, but I want to hear it from the horse's mouth. So, Linda, if you're with us, maybe we'll start with you and then pick up with Thomas. Can you hear me, Linda?
I guess you want me to answer that question.
Yes, please. Not just me. I'll bet there are some others who want an answer to that question.
Way that Tom, or certainly, and we obviously don't agree about everything because that's the nature of any relationship in life. Is that those two events were very separate events. The event that was the protest against Evo Morales running for a fourth term, which he was not permitted to do under the terms of the 2009 Constitution. And there were very legitimate concerns. There were certainly large numbers of students in the streets, a lot of whom were very much manipulated because the right wing really had or even the center had no real policy proposals for what they wanted to do with the country. They simply beat the drum of fraud repeatedly, and which encouraged people to go in the streets. So there was a certain degree of manipulation, but there was also a legitimate concern. Bolivia has gone through a large number of dictatorships in its time, a large number of people who have stayed in power, not respecting the Constitution. And Evo Morales effectively was in my opinion, doing exactly that. However, the process that happened that dislodged him was very much unconstitutional. And that is why I would call what happened a coup. The people who are supposed to succeed him according to the constitutional succession were threatened with violence. Their families were threatened until they resigned, and then a group of people who were not elected officials in any way, shape, or form, basically appointed Janine Áñez, who was the second vice president of the Senate, to become the president. And at that point, it was the far right, because Janine Áñez really represents far right interests and is from a very conservative party.
She just ended on hijack, so maybe I'll just hijack what Linda was saying, since it sounds like she's disappearing. I think in Bolivia, there's this dichotomy where it's like, was there fraud or was there a coup? And I think first it's important, really at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if there was fraud or not. It doesn't matter if Evo was the best president or the worst president. You cannot overthrow presidents illegally like what happened in Bolivia. So in terms of the fraud narrative, these seeds were planted months and months before the elections. So just like in the United States, Trump had planted these seeds and kind of right-wing zealots ran with this. So the moment the first ballot was cast, people yelled fraud. And so I think, the OAS certainly perpetuated this by saying, oh, there's some irregularities, we're really concerned. But there's been analysis since then, both through the Washington Post, the New York Times, MIT, various institutions have analyzed whether or not there was fraud. And according to them, there was not. I am a human rights lawyer, so I'm not a statistician. I can't speak to that, but there are certainly a lot of articles on the Washington Post, in the New York Times, MIT. These folks can address that, and they have, and they said there was not fraud. I think the more important thing is, and the reason I say that it doesn't matter if there's fraud, if we talk about torture in Guantanamo, it's irrelevant if the person was, going to blow up a building and is a terrorist or is not. It doesn't matter. Torture is torture. And a coup is a coup, whether or not Evo should have stayed in power or not. And I think this is a really problematic, I think it just derails the more important conversation. And just for a moment, most of this I won't dive into the weeds, but I'm going to dive into the weeds just for a second on this coup issue, because I think there's still this really problematic debate on whether or not there was a coup. So in Bolivia, first of all, only 4 people can become president: the president, vice president, president of Senate, and president of Congress. That's the line of succession. Every single one of these 4 people resigned under threats to violence. They kidnapped high-level Mas officials. They burned Evo Morales' sister's house. They ransacked his house. Victor Borda, who was the head of the president of Congress, they kidnapped his brother, tortured him, sexually assaulted his niece, and said, if you don't resign, we're going to kill your brother. So he explicitly, said, I'm resigning to save the life of my brother. There's nothing democratic about a transition like that. It's clear. And then after that, you have right-wing zealots from the right, from the Santa Cruz region. This person Camacho, who's to say he's right-wing is an understatement. When he was a youth, he was part of this youth league that you can see videos on the internet of them doing the Nazi salute. I mean, they are quite literal fascists. He went on television and explicitly said that he paid the police to mutiny to force Evo's resignation. He said that his father, who was part of the dictatorships, a couple decades ago, his father negotiated with the military to force Evo's resignation. And he explicitly has admitted that the person who was in charge of this negotiation on behalf of the military received an award, which was he was named Minister of Defense by the new coup government. Again, nothing about this is democratic. And I think the third thing that's super important is that you have, following that resignation of Evo, when all these leaders fled to save their own lives, you have this meeting that the Catholic Church organized with all these opposition members. There was members of the Catholic Church, the Brazilian ambassador, obviously Brazil's government is a far right-wing government, a right-wing representative of the EU, and then several opposition members sat down and decided, we're going to name Jeanine Áñez as the next president. None of these folks are elected officials. Bolivia, which is the most indigenous country in all the Americas, none of these folks are indigenous. There was nothing democratic about it. They just sat around. It's the equivalent of Jim, you, me, and Linda sitting around and saying, who do we want to name the next president? Picking up our phone and quite literally calling during this meeting and offering it to who we decide. Nothing democratic about that. So this is a coup. I think that the really problematic part is that, as you mentioned, Jim, that the rest of the world, and even in Bolivia, there's still this debate, was this a coup? And I think a lot of it has to do with misinformation or disinformation spread by the right wing once they took power. To tie it to the United States, Áñez's government hired an organization in the United States called CLS Strategies. This group is run by a guy named Mark Firestein, who right now is an advisor for Biden, who worked for the Bureau of Western Hemispheric Affairs for Obama. And this organization basically was hired to rebrand the image of Áñez, the Áñez government, in terms of human rights, democracy, and elections. And what they did is they created a bunch of fake Facebook accounts, Twitter accounts. They were the first U.S. organization actually punished by Facebook for spreading fake information, for creating fake accounts. And so this has really been part of their strategy, is to spread all this disinformation and really lobby folks, lobby institutions. Well, Democrats, Republicans, lobby governments, but also lobby institutions that work in human rights daily, bombarding Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, these larger human rights institutions, and saying, look, there was no coup. Though Human Rights Watch, I will give them this, did say that this was a coup. They've been really quite successful at really painting a different narrative that's been really, problematic here, and it allowed this coup government to stay in power for, roughly a year.
So there's a lot there and a lot of follow-up questions. If you'll allow me to synthesize what you said and what Linda said, is I think you separated into two moments. The debate about whether there was electoral fraud, which will, together with that, you have the issues of should Evo have been a candidate or not? Was he trying to maintain himself in power beyond the legitimate constitutional limits? Entirely independent of those questions, there's what happened in the days and weeks that eventually led to the Áñez presidency. And both of you are quite clear that this is a coup because of the violence, the threats, the succession, the use of terror, and the fact that it was cooked up by a group of people, the Catholic Church, the Brazilian embassy, that have nothing to do with succession in Bolivia. But let me go back to the first set of issues, because I do think it's important. And I think it's important, we'll get to this at the end, I hope, in terms of what this book, what happened in Bolivia, what it means for Bolivia and for the rest of the hemisphere and for the rest of the world because I think we do have to be on guard for the idea, which is one of the main ideas that come out of Bolivia and other places, that if there was fraud, or if one can allege fraud with some minimally convincing basis, then violent actions and other means of changing leadership is legitimate. So I do want to get back to, and I know you're not a statistician, Thomas, you have a lot of capacities, I read them, but also to Linda, about the fraud. What was being said in real time, and then what happened afterwards with the OAS and MIT? I don't know if you can speak briefly about that, because that does continue to linger in a way that I think may have consequences for other states. So what was being said in real time about fraud, and what was the analysis afterwards? In terms of, again, for people who are not Bolivia experts, who won or who didn't win wasn't even at stake. What was at stake was the difference between the candidates, right? So maybe you can just talk about that a bit, please. Linda, if you're with us, if you can start on that would be great.
I think I'm back. Am I back?
You're back.
I'm here. The fraud narrative was one that was constructed way before the election. It was the opposition had decided, much like later in the United States, that they were going to decry fraud no matter what the results were. And that was very clear to me various times when we were waiting on Sunday night for the results to come in, that even when their candidate, when Carlos Mesa was actually leading, who was the main opposition candidate, they were still saying it was fraud. I mean, it was so deeply entrenched, this notion of fraud. And then the OAS had held a press conference, which I attended, and on the basis of effectively no evidence, they announced that they announced irregularities, which was a discourse that they continued to use, and then did a study and a review in which they showed these supposed irregularities. This study has since been certainly on some would say debunked, but certainly very seriously questioned by large numbers of researchers from all over the world. A few people have supported the OAS, but for the most part, everybody who is a serious statistician and done serious research has come out saying that, in fact, there was no fraud, or if there was any evidence of fraud, it was not significant. I think a really important point that for me, when I did the research on the book, was that I discovered that that there really are no international standards to determine what fraud is in an election. It's based on local conditions. Well, of course, that means it's based on whoever has access to the microphone and their subjective opinion about whether or not fraud has taken place. It really is not based on any set of sort of internationally established criteria. So it makes fraud a very easily manipulated trope that can be used by an opposition party in order to debunk an election. And most recently, it has been used very effectively by the right wing and by the far right wing. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, recently we heard the same thing in Peru in the Castillo elections. And it's a very, look, even in the United States, this supposed democracy, which certainly is far from true, it's very easy to find irregularities. And what happened is the right wing capitalized on these irregularities. I mean, this is not, things ranging from in very small villages, the same person, the person in charge of like signatures wrote showing that these votes took place. They're signed in several different communities. This is the norm in Bolivia, but it's easy to capitalize on one single small thing. I mean, I think the thing that was really problematic is right after the elections, Bolivia, to win the presidency, you have to win either with a majority or with 40% and beat the second place person by 10%. So what had happened in Bolivia on Sunday night, the quick count, which is kind of not the formal count, but it's the public count that you can kind of follow what's going on, stopped. The following day, And at this point, Evo Morales was less than that 10% threshold, And then the following day, he jumped up above 10%. And this is when the right wing said, see, look what happened. Look, there's fraud. How did it jump? Well, I mean, it's totally understandable because in Bolivia, the indigenous communities, the rural communities, those votes come in later. And if you look at the trend on the last several elections, every single time, the following day, those votes, the votes for the MAS party have jumped up because it's gone to the MAS candidate, which is generally a indigenous person, which represents generally indigenous communities. It's the same in the United States. If you look at all of a sudden, when votes from California come in, it bumps up for Democrats. It's very explainable. But the OAS and the right wing jumped and said, no, something seems really crazy. And then once that was out there, there was no turning back. People went to the streets. They really bought this narrative that it had been, as Linda said, had been cooked up months and months before. I can say this personally because I was here and I heard people saying, oh, there's going to be fraud. I mean, they were already, that had been written in stone. They had said this was going to be fraud. And so that's really kind of the I would say like the match that really ignited the tinderbox and really started, what was the beginning of the coup.
So let me, if I can, I do want to return to the questions of fraud, the way the narrative preceded the elections, the way, as you say, folks on the right had decided how they would play this, so to speak, regardless of what actually happened in the elections, and what that might mean for other places in the Americas. And I know both of you know a good deal about not just Bolivia, but about the Western Hemisphere. So I want to get back to that. But let me, if I can, track the book a bit. One of the things that I think is great about this book, and there's a lot that I think is great about this book, and please buy this, is that you present this book not just to folks very familiar with Bolivia, but people who want to be familiar with Bolivia. And you start with unpacking Bolivia. So let's do that if we could. If you can just give us a sort of a brief sense of what should people who are not experts on Bolivia know about Bolivia to tee up who is this Evo Morales figure? How did he get elected? What did he represent? What did he achieve? And what challenges and issues were there with his time in governance? But before that, in just a few minutes, which I know is a crazy question, 5 centuries of Bolivian history, please. Who wants to bite at that one? 3 minutes.
Well, let me, Bolivia, I'll start. Bolivia is the most indigenous country in the Americas, as Tom said. It's also the poorest country in South America. Maybe now Venezuela has definitely surpassed it on that front, but historically it's been the poorest. It's a landlocked country. It lost its access to the sea in the late 19th century to Chile. And I think the most significant thing about its economy is, like many countries of the global South, it is a mono-producing economy. It is largely historically been a mining country. One of the largest Spanish mines, there were 2 enormous Spanish mines that fed the Spanish Empire. One was in Mexico and the other was in Potosi in Bolivia. And the country has depended on the extraction and the export of raw materials throughout its entire history, starting with silver and gold, and then later in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, tin, and then after that, moving into, one might argue, coca, but also up to natural gas. There have also been rubber booms, etc. And Bolivia is still very much a mining country. And most recently, it has been involved in a lot of extractive agriculture in terms of soy. So I think that is the context. It's a country that's very poor. It's never really had the ability to turn its economic or its resource wealth into industrialized goods. So it sells raw materials to a northern country who turns around and makes a product that it sells back to countries like Bolivia, of course, at an elevated price. So the value added of Bolivia's resources basically has never stayed in Bolivia, except in the hands of a small elite who have facilitated the extraction by multinationals, let's just say, or by internationals, whether it's the Spanish or in the 19th century, the English, and then more recently in the 20th century, the U.S., and then now with mining, particular mining interests from Canada. Well, actually, to be fair, not Canada. I'm just somewhere right now where there's a lot of Canadian investment in mining, but some British investment in mining, some U.S. investment in mining, and a lot of Brazilian investment in soy. So it's really been a resource-dependent country, and a very indigenous country. And as a landlocked country, it has in many ways maintained indigenous cultural traditions, partly because indigenous people are the majority and have historically been the majority, but also because it's been quite cut off from the rest of the world. I mean, obviously the internet tends to change all that, but certainly until very recently, that was very much the case.
So, sorry, can I add just a little bit onto that? Because please. I want to make sure that this part doesn't get lost, is the racial component. And Linda has mentioned it, that Bolivia is the most indigenous country in the Americas. But historically, it's always been people who have skin that's as light as mine running the country for centuries. As she mentioned, the mines in Potosí, Eduardo Galeano said you could build a bridge from the mines in Potosí to Spain. Folks in Potosí will tell you could build a bridge with the bones of the indigenous people that were exploited extracting the silver for gringos like us. And so historically, indigenous have been completely excluded from politics. And much of that changed when Evo Morales came to power in just about 15 years ago.
So let's talk about that. Explain who is Evo Morales and what did he represent when he came to power? And if you can just pick up on that thought, Thomas.
Sure. I'll give the very short version and we can expand on it. But Evo was, the first indigenous president in Bolivia. There's potentially another one. There's a debate on this, but really the first one that at least identified as indigenous. And really, he was a threat to the United States. He redistributed wealth, poverty, extreme poverty. These things, he reduced them drastically. Bolivia was the poorest country. It's now bumped up to the second poorest. But still, that's, a big jump in South America. It had the highest Gini coefficient, the highest inequality rate, which, he chipped away at. And really the economy up until the coup, the fastest growing economy in or at least in South America. And really the people that benefited most were indigenous. During his first government, I believe it was 15 of 17 or 13 of 15, basically the majority, I think all but 2 of his cabinet posts were indigenous people. And so he really changed the dynamic of the country. And at the end of the day, and I think we'll probably touch on this a little bit later, there were all these critiques of the MAS, and some of them are definitely legitimate, and they fueled a lot of the protests during this kind of the conflicts in 2019. But so much of what fueled it was racism, was people that were mad that really at the end of the day, an indigenous man was in power and controlling the country. And I think for the United States and places in the global north, Abel was very outspoken about our human rights violations in the United States or our exploitation of working folks. And so he really was a threat, I think, to the global north and to capitalists. He definitely, his discourse at least was very socialist. It was kind of this mixed economy, but certainly was a threat to companies. When he came into power, he nationalized. It wasn't a full nationalization, but took control of many of these industries that they signed these contracts for radically exploitive contracts. And so Evo Morales said, no, these are not fair. We're going to take 50, slightly over 50%, so that the Bolivian people have control over the resources. And so this really radicalized the country, and folks really liked him, and he was really popular. And in his elections, he won with a really big majority. But this was a threat to U.S. interests. This was a threat to corporate interests. And this was a threat to the right wing in Bolivia. And I think a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of that is what fueled a lot of the unrest in 2019. And really people capitalized on this fraud narrative. They looked for whatever. Really, at the end of the day, they threw it all against the wall, and whatever stuck they were going to run with. But there were folks that were mad that an indigenous person with at least socialist discourse was a real challenge to the paradigm that had always been in power here in Bolivia.
Let me pick up on that. And ask both of you, but we'll start with Linda. The assessment you make as someone, and both of you, deeply involved in Bolivia over the period of Evo Morales' governance and the MAS period in power until the 2019 coup. What assessment do you make in terms of What was done well? What was done less than well? What's the assessment that both of you make of that period? Linda, let's start with you if you're online.
Yeah, no, I'm here. 14 years is quite a long time for anyone to be in power through democratic means, for sure. And the MAS did make enormous advances, and some research that I've just recently done on rural Indigenous women's rights shows that was the group. And all over the world, rural and Indigenous women, or rural women, and peasant women are the poorest people on the planet, and they're the ones who do the most work. And this was the group that advanced the most under Evo Morales. I mean, it was quite impressive when you look at issues around education and improvements in income and declines in child mortality and maternal mortality, et cetera. That was the group that advanced the greatest under Evo Morales. So I think that the accomplishment of the Morales government was reducing poverty and particularly reducing extreme poverty in Bolivia. It certainly did not eradicate poverty, but it reduced it significantly. And that I think is really its crowning achievement. It also expanded Indigenous rights through the work that it did to enable the 2009 Constituent Assembly to happen, and which is also significant, and expanded women's rights. I mean, now half of the legislature is women. I mean, this is the second or third, it sort of changes from one election to the other, level of women's participation in a national legislature in the world. This is significant in a country where women only got the vote in 1952. So, I'm trying to think what else I want to highlight. In particular, they really did an enormous amount for rural people, who had really was an abandoned population, and most of Bolivia's rural population is definitely indigenous. So these were the groups that made the greatest strides, both economically, in terms of political participation, and in terms of a revaluing of culture and a real, I would say, a diminishing of the very deeply entrenched racism that had shaped the society. That's not to say it didn't come roaring back in 2019, but it really did. It really did drop. Some of the problems that the Morales government had were issues around being an extractive economy, and which is historically has countries with extractive economies, most countries have very weak governments, and Bolivia had a weak government. And in fact, the Morales administration made the government stronger. It expanded the government threefold. It provided a far greater level of services to the population, sometimes well, sometimes not so well. But it's still, the style in Bolivia of management and of leadership is very much concentrated usually in the hands of a strong male leader. And that was definitely who Evo Morales was. He is a very charismatic man, and he was able to, power became increasingly concentrated around him and his inner circle, whereas the commitment from the beginning was to have much more dispersed power and to have a much more participatory process. That process certainly started that way at the beginning, but towards the end of the time that he was in office, that was starting to fall away more and more. The other big issue that, and I hesitate to call this a failing of the Morales government, but because it's such a complicated issue for a country like Bolivia to address, which is the issue of extractivism. I mean, effectively, the country used the extractive process, the money that they managed to renegotiate and get a better deal from on gas, particularly, in order to fund social programs and in order to overcome poverty. This comes at a huge cost to the environment and came at a cost also to lowland indigenous peoples, particularly. The gas is in the lowland part of the country. The vast majority of indigenous people live in the highlands and valleys, but there are a number of indigenous groups in the lowlands. And they had never had their history was very different from that of the Highland and Valley peoples in terms of organization. And the Morales administration never managed to completely get them on board. And as extractivism expanded, and there was more push to grant concessions for oil and gas exploration in national parks and indigenous territories, because in Bolivia, like most of, I think, Latin America, the government owns subsoil rights, so you can own the land to grow your crops, but you don't own the subsoil rights. So there was a core of a conflict that has only grown over time between Eastern indigenous people and the government on the one hand, and Bolivia has faced increasing incredibly high rates of deforestation, particularly again in the last 6 or 7 years. So there's an expansion of the agricultural frontier with all of the negative consequences that has for the environment. So Evo Morales was very good at giving a very good talk internationally about defending the environment. But coming out of the dependence on extractivism is not an easy path and would never have been an easy path. But I don't know that they really ever took that on or felt like they could take that on in a significant way.
So there's a lot that you said there, and it sets up another question I want to get to. Our time is moving quickly. It's a fascinating talk. Thank you both. But I was wondering, maybe Thomas, if you could take us from the underlying tensions that Linda laid out in terms of extractivism in terms of regions of the country, ethnic tensions, governance style. How did that and maybe other factors set the stage for the crisis and the coup in 2019? What were the underlying factors, in addition to the ones that Linda was talking about, which are sort of more longer term and structural? What else was percolating in 2019 that led to the coup?
I mean, I can mention, I think sorry, there's a little bit of feedback. I can mention the things that were capitalized on. Again, I think the real stuff that was driving it was racism, classism, folks wanting to take power again. But there were things like fires in Chiquitania that was really, how do I put this, fashionable. There were fires that were blamed on Evo Morales, and there was a really keen right-wing team that did hashtag SOS Bolivia or hashtag SOS Chiquitania and things like that. That really, basically, anything that went wrong, it was easy to point fingers to Evo Morales. And certainly, as Linda mentioned, I think that there are some real issues with the extractivism. I mean, it was kind of a you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't situation, because a lot of that was used to help folks that had been excluded from a lot of the programs in Bolivia. But things like the fires in Bolivia, this narrative of fraud and various other things really helped mobilize people and bring them into the streets. And you have like these right-wing groups that really capitalized on these errors, some perceived errors, some actual errors. And then when the fraud thing happened, the alleged fraud, again, it exploded, and they were able to just completely take over the streets, burn down buildings, kidnap Bolivian officials, MAS officials. I mean, I represent one of the officials, Patricia Arce, who was kidnapped, tortured, dragged through the streets. They put her in front of cameras and said, you need to denounce the MAS party right now. Instead, she said, I will never denounce this process of change. You can kill me, but we will continue fighting for social justice or something along those lines. I mean, this spectacular woman, really they capitalized on, again, real mistakes, real missteps, but also perceived mistakes and missteps to paint this narrative that this fraudulent narco dictator Evo Morales is destroying the country, and it was successful.
So let me, if I can, and Linda, ask you and Thomas as well after. So getting back to 2019, there are tensions, there are protests, there's some legitimate concerns. There's also a lot of manipulation and distortion of those concerns and leveraging of those concerns. And there's a coup, and Áñez is basically taken from beyond the list of succession and, in effect, as you say, placed in the presidency. Tell us about her period in governance. What happens? What's the summary of that period?
Maybe I'll start with that.
Yeah, let Tom start with that one.
In part because, I spent too long investigating the human rights abuses during this. So much so that just actually to put into perspective this government put me on a list of seditious people that was going to get put in jail because I was investigating human rights abuses. Áñez is this right-wing zealot evangelical Christian that was relatively unknown, honestly. Nobody really knew who she was, other than she was kind of a little bit known for sending out racist tweets about indigenous people, calling their acts, their ceremonies satanic and stuff like that. So she came to power and illegally went out on, in the palace, picked up a Bible, quite literally larger than her torso, and said, basically that the Christ had returned. Her allies had literally entered the palace and said that Pachamama, the Mother Earth goddess, would never return. So she came in and swinging instantly. Basically fired, kicked out most of the Mas party. Really, honestly, charged them with sedition, terrorism. In her first few days, first week alone, her government carried out 2 massacres. She jumped into, I think on her third day, there was a massacre in the town of Sacaba. I was there in this town. She sent in troops that slaughtered indigenous protesters. Protesters had come out in defense of the Huipala, the indigenous flag that was burnt, that her government had basically stepped on, literally and figuratively. And her government massacred people. One of the things that I remembered, because I like I said, I was there. I snuck into the hospitals and interviewed folks, and something that I still remember. And I heard this repeatedly. But one of the victims who had just come out of a coma was shot in the eye. He was saving another person who had been shot, and he was trying to drag him away. And a soldier shot him, targeted him for helping other people, and shot him in the eye. And he started telling me, he said, "You're going to see tomorrow. They're going to say we did this. They're going to say we're communists, we're narco terrorists." And at the end of the day, it's because we're indigenous. And honestly, I almost didn't believe it. I mean, I've been in Bolivia long enough to know the racism here, but it was such a clear massacre. I've documented massacres quite literally, on multiple continents. This was a very clear massacre. But the following day, the news said indigenous people shot themselves. The narrative quite literally was they shot themselves to make the Mas government look bad. A few days later, there was a second massacre in Sencata.
To make the Áñez government look bad, you mean, Thomas? They shot themselves to make the Áñez government look bad.
I'm sorry. Thank you. Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yes. And a few days later, the Áñez government did the same thing in a town in this area of El Alto, just outside La Paz, called Sencata, where again, troops came in, slaughtered indigenous people. 100% of the people killed or injured were indigenous. 100% of the people killed or injured were protesters. So no police, no military, none on that side of state forces were killed or injured. But the narrative once again was, no, they shot themselves, or they were going to blow up the city. All these really local narratives. And this just really was the beginning of what became arguably one of the most, repressive periods, probably the most repressive period since the dictatorships. I mean, this month of November was the second deadliest month since Bolivia became a democracy about 40 years ago in terms of state forces killing people. And then it just went on this rampage. They started arresting people who spoke out against the government. They were charged with terrorism or sedition. They would shut down indigenous radio stations. If you were a journalist from one of the commercial stations and were outspoken about the government, you were charged with sedition or terrorism. I spent most of the year, much of this time in jail with folks, interviewing them. There was this poor kid that I remember who literally was the domain owner of a website that printed an article criticizing Áñez. And the person who wrote the article was charged with terrorism. And he, for owning the website that had this critical article, also was thrown in jail for terrorism. So they went after folks left and right. And they really targeted indigenous Mas politicians, Mas supporters, and people that were perceived as Mas supporters. So it didn't matter. I mean, at the end of the day, really, if you were indigenous to this government, you were Mas. and you are a terrorist. So people that went through non-indigenous neighborhoods were rounded up. They were arrested. The police were collaborating with these really what became parastate groups, civilian vigilante groups that would see an indigenous person in the neighborhood, grab them, and either they would torture them or the police would torture them. They would get thrown in jail. They would get charged with sedition and terrorism. It was a really unprecedented year in terms of abuses. And sorry, I'm going to be a lawyer for a second, but because there's this debate on like whether this was a coup, whether there were really human rights abuses, I should mention that, you know, we did at University Network for Human Rights and Harvard Law School, we did a report, you know, an 8-10 month investigation into this. But so did the Inter-American Commission, so did Human Rights Watch, so did Amnesty International, so did this expert group set up by the Inter-American Commission, so did the Ombudsperson's Office. They all universally had found that these were massacres and that these were widespread abuses that took place. I mean, this was a dictatorship. This is how dictatorships behave. But I will say the one thing that was interesting that I kept hearing from people that I interviewed is this is worse than the dictatorships. Because at least in the dictatorships, we knew what was happening. At least the public, the international community knew this is a dictatorship. The difference with this government is that they had a prettier face. They had hired this team, like I said, CLS Strategies, to paint this completely different image of this democratic government that was saving Bolivia from dictator Evo Morales. Meanwhile, if you spoke out against them, you were thrown in jail, or you were shot, or you were tortured. So people who lived through the dictatorships in this period repeatedly have told me this was worse than the formal dictatorship period, you know, the 70s and 60s.
Well, let me, if I can, ask a follow-up question on the issues that you raised, which I think are important. And I say this, you know, my background is in human rights, as you know, Thomas and others. I worked with Thomas and have worked with Thomas for years and on human rights issues in Bolivia when we were both at Harvard Law School. But I'm particularly interested in the relevance of human rights in the narrative and the narratives that eventually led to the demise of the Áñez government. So I'm hoping that you, Thomas, and Linda, you as well, can talk about what role did these various reports, the report by the University Network for Human Rights and Harvard Law School, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, the expert group, the HIE, or expert group of the Inter-American Commission, what role did that have in changing the understanding about what was happening in Bolivia? And by extension, what had happened before and what is happening now? So can you talk about what does human rights have to do with all this?
I may just continue on with this and then please jump in, Linda. I mean, I think the good and bad of this stuff is, you know, unfortunately, there's still this strong deference to the colonial North. And let's be clear, folks on the ground, folks in Sincata, were very clear. They said we were massacred, but folks didn't listen. And it took, honestly, the international community, gringos like us, to basically try to share their voices. And I think, unfortunately, this is it did move the needle. It's what made people listen. Really, I think what took this government down were these abuses. You know, Áñez came to power under the pretext that she was going to call new elections. Legally, she had to within 90 days. She kept changing this. She kept kicking that can down the road. And really, you know, I think if there weren't critiques from social movements, definitely in Bolivia, but also the international community starting to chip away at this narrative that this was a democratic government, I think she would have stayed. Who knows how long she would have stayed. But I think, you know, we had a space to say something that folks on the ground didn't. You know, I don't want to rob. I think that the main thing that really did move the needle were social movements going out and protesting. But at the end of the day, if you spoke out against this government, you were thrown in jail. If you protested, you were shot, you were thrown in jail. And so it took collaboration with the international community and social movements to really draw attention to what was happening. And once these institutions started showing, look, this is not a democratic government, they're killing people, really they lost a lot of support from the international community. I mean, the U.S. government, it became a liability. I mean, Bolivia is never really a priority of the U.S. government, but eventually it became a liability supporting these people who go on television and say, we're going to hunt you down like animals, you're terrorists. I mean, I remember Linda during this period. I mean, I've known Linda for years and I've never seen her so scared. I mean, I was legitimately scared, but you know, the minister of communications went on TV and said, we have a list of seditious journalists. clearly Linda was on this list. I was put on a list of seditious people. I was attacked. I mean, just to give a little context, you mentioned that I've worked on this case against the ex-president of Bolivia. For a long period, I quite literally had a price on my head. But despite that, I've never had problems in Bolivia. When the coup happened, I've been attacked 6-7 times by groups in the street, by groups allied with
physically attacked.
Physically attacked, surrounded, where they say you're a communist, you're a terrorist. Then they'll say, homophobic and other horrible things as well. And they'll say, get out of my country or we'll kill you or we'll throw you in jail. Or they'll say, the police are on our side. We'll get them and we'll drag you in jail. And some of these times, that has happened. I couldn't count the number of times, but also physically attacked, where they literally start shoving me. I've been hit because I work in human rights. This was the discourse of that government, that human rights work is subversive. Criticizing the government is subversive. Being a journalist is subversive, like Linda. And so it was really quite challenging. But I will say, and part of the reason I think that the international community was able to play at least some role in changing this is because, at the end of the day, once I was put on a seditious list, I was very fortunate. I know my privilege. I was able to be in the United States. An indigenous person who was outspoken did not have that right. They didn't have that ability to just escape the situation. I should mention, this is part of why Linda and I debated whether we even wanted to write the book as gringos from the global north. Why are we writing it? At the end of the day, because we were in some ways the only ones who could, because those who spoke out were universally thrown in jail or were tortured or were beaten or were shot. And so I think the human rights critiques that really chipped away at this narrative of democracy opened the door for the social movements to have a little more space to go out and protest, and really is what I think led to elections roughly a year after Áñez illegally took power.
So let me just say, kudos to you for staying in Bolivia and doing this work, facing the risks that you faced, and for recognizing that the risks that you faced are not nearly as severe as the risks that those who are Bolivian, who are indigenous, who can't leave Bolivia face, and who don't have foreign passports. Like, the risks they face are more severe, and thank you for recognizing that. But also thank you for being allies and for using your privilege to advance the cause that the folks you're working with want to see advanced. So let me just comment. I'm sure there are others who would say the same thing. And certainly a lot of Bolivians and people that I've spoken to in Bolivia have said that to me about you. So I think this is a really important book, and I thank you for doing it. It's important for many, many reasons. You started to tee up there at the end, and I'd love to hear both of you, Linda and Thomas, both on from the outside looking in. And I remember in real time watching this. The elections kept getting postponed, and I think the Áñez government was using COVID as a basis for postponing the elections. I sort of thought, I don't know if there will be elections. I think this government wants to entrench itself and remain. And then the elections were held, and the result was an overwhelming victory for Arce and for the MAS. Can you explain that to a non-Bolivian audience? What happened? How did that happen?
Well, I think that, yeah, okay. I think that it was the social movements that really became reinvigorated again, and were the ones who really took to the streets, particularly in August, and really forced Áñez. It became increasingly clear that the Áñez government was simply, as you say, using COVID to postpone elections as indefinitely as they could, so they could consolidate power more and sort of get rid of more of the people who were standing in their way of that process. I can't remember what was the other part of your question, Jim? I'm sorry, I spaced it out.
But how did this sweeping victory occur? Because people on the outside I did not expect that. Maybe just I was wrong.
I think in many ways, none of us really expected it. I think that. But then when thinking about it, you did, because I talked to dozens and dozens and dozens of working class people who said essentially the following. This was before 2019 election, was We want the process of change, which was what the Hamas had been doing. We want this political project to continue, political and social project to continue, but it's time for Evo to go. We need a new leader. And that was a very, among working class and indigenous people who supported the Hamas, they were increasingly becoming also uncomfortable with Evo remaining. Once the Hamas got a new leader in place, Luis Arce and David Choquehuanca, once they got them into place, combined with the horror that people went through during the Áñez government, they really got a taste not just of a neoliberal government, which they had suffered through before, but really an ultra-right government, a neo-fascist government. Then people really were determined to bring the Hamas back to power. I mean, not only was Áñez and her cohort really nasty people, they were also really incompetent. I think that in the course of a year, I think there are about 17 ministries in Bolivia normally. I mean, they change. Some get open, some get shut, whatever. But there are 17 ministries. I think she had a total of, like, in 1 year, 34 different ministers. So, which showed that nobody had the capacity to really run the government. The public administration kind of did not function. And so people remember that under the Hamas, relative to previous years, for certainly the public administration where, you could go and get your identity card without spending 6 days to do it, So I think that all of those factors were involved in the victory of bringing the Hamas back. And also the Hamas was associated with economic good times. And from the point that COVID started on, the economy was tanking like it was everywhere around the world.
Let me just flag, for sure, Thomas. Let me just say one thing, Thomas, is that we have some questions and we'll get to them. I just want people to keep sending in your questions. We'll spend some time with that. We still have about a half an hour. Thomas, back to you. Sorry.
I'll keep it short, because I think I agree with Linda somewhat, and I think I disagree a little bit in terms of certainly I've talked to people that said, it's Evo's time is up. He should move on. But I talked to others that I really don't, and this isn't to discount the things that Lucho Arce has done when he was minister. I don't think it mattered. I think at the end of the day, the elections were, do you support fascism or no? I don't know if the candidate really mattered. I think at that point, after seeing such a repressive year, folks showed up, lined up to vote because they didn't want to live in a dictatorship anymore. I think if Evo was the candidate, I believe he would have won. I don't think he would have won with the same numbers that Lucho Arce did. He won with about 55% compared to Mesa's 28%. I mean, he basically doubled what Mesa had. So it was a landslide victory. I don't think Evo would have gotten those numbers, but I also think that people at the end of the day, there were all these critiques, and there are certainly really valid critiques of the Hamas, but these kind of micro critiques, we should be constantly, self-reflecting. We should be criticizing any government, left or right. But at the end of the day, I think folks were like, okay, maybe I wish he consulted indigenous communities more before putting in a road, which he should do, absolutely. But he wasn't gunning down people who spoke out against him. And I think that people showed up to vote because they were like, we don't want fascism anymore. And I think what represented that is, rather than talk about all these statistics, and I feel like we've gotten very academic about it, I'll just kind of throw in a little personal experience. I was at the headquarters when the Hamas won. And unlike, if you see like when the Democrats or Republicans win, they start cranking Queen, we are whatever, and partying. This was not a party. People literally collapsed on the ground and started crying. And I got a phone call from Patricia Arce. And I've never heard, and I've known her for years, and I've for quite a while now. And during when she was being kidnapped, this was the mayor that I'd mentioned. And at the time, she had run for Senate during the 2020 elections, during the dictatorship, while she was being hunted down by the government, while she was being hunted down by parastate groups. And she won. And she called me the moment they won. And her voice was shaking. She could barely kind of talk about it. And she said, I can breathe for the first time in a year. My family can come out of hiding for the first time in a year. I can have a normal life. She could care less that she was just elected senator. It was that this government that was just taking out people left and right, it was going to be gone. And that the government, that the Hamas and whatever they represented with all their flaws, could come back to power. And I think you're right, Jim. A lot of folks were really worried about this. I mean, I was there for the elections, and I remember the day of the elections, Anya's sent out 75,000 co-police and military forces, 75,000 troops in La Paz alone to start going through the streets, intimidating people, scaring people from voting. I mean, this is the stuff that happens in dictatorships. So petrified. So Lucho Arce won, just doubling the second place candidate. It was honestly kind of weird because I remember going around the streets and thinking people were going to be celebrating, but it was like, is this going to last? Is something going to happen? I mean, now we know that at the time there was actually a plan for a second coup. The defense minister, the one who I mentioned earlier that had negotiated with Camacho about forcing Abel to resign, had actually reached out to mercenaries and brought mercenaries to La Paz. Some of the mercenaries who were involved in the assassination of the Haitian president just a few months ago. So there was real fear that there was going to be a second coup or something to block the MAS from taking power. But with such extreme numbers, doubling the second place candidate, I think there were not the conditions where they would be able to get away with it. The international community was not going to be able to accept that kind of coup. I mean, that's the thing is these 21st century coups, you can't do the 70s styles coup where you quite literally take over and drive down the streets in a tank. You have to, say it's something, there's an issue with democracy or, fraud, these kind of other extra legal kind of lawfare excuses to take people out of power, like what happened in Brazil and in Paraguay, some ways Honduras, Haiti. They couldn't get away with like an old school coup. And now we live in a somewhat better Bolivia right now. By the way, I'm in Bolivia. That's why I say we.
So there are two things I want to ask, and hopefully you can give concise answers, although they're big questions, I think. And then I want to turn to some of the questions that we've received, and maybe we'll receive some more from the folks who are watching this online in real time. Here are the two things. One is related to what you just said, Thomas, which is why does this coup, this experience in Bolivia, matter in Bolivia and beyond? You talked about 21st century coups. What are you talking about? What's the threat? What's the danger? Why, even if you don't care about Bolivia, and Bolivia matters for Bolivia, first and foremost, evidently. But beyond that, why does it matter? What are the lessons? What do we see? What are the threats? You've talked about priming and preparing a narrative of fraud to facilitate violent change. What have we seen in Bolivia? What should we learn from that? So that's one question. And then I'd love your assessment of how are things going in Bolivia now with the Arce government? So those are the two questions. Maybe I'll throw them out together, and then we'll turn to some of the questions that we've received from viewers. And I don't know who wants to start, Thomas or Linda. We'll go back to you. Maybe start with Linda, then come back to you, Thomas.
Yeah, I think that what we saw in Bolivia, Bolivia is so often just such an exaggerated case of things that go on in other parts of the world. I mean, that the lessons are so stark there. And I think that what happened in Bolivia and like Tom said, in other countries in Latin America, of this kind of coup light, which is not putting the tanks in the street, or at least not immediately, and not having that kind of level of military takeover, unfortunately is becoming, and using the fraud narrative, consistently using a fraud narrative or using judicial means like a corruption cases in order to subvert the voting process and the ability of people to elect their leaders is terrifyingly widespread and is only increasing. And it's a playbook that has worked very well for the far right and for the right wing, and they're continuing to use it. And it's really fundamentally undercutting democratic processes throughout the hemisphere and and it's happening in Europe to a certain degree as well, and certainly in the United States. And so it's a very frightening trend. And I think that Bolivia's case, as it is with many issues, is so sharply drawn that you can really see how these particular sets of forces play out. In terms of the issues about how the government has done in the last year, well, they're competent at running a public administration. So they immediately moved on the COVID stuff. They got a lot of vaccines. They were way down at the very bottom of the line for the COVID vaccines, and tests, and they really moved quickly to address that. They were very determined not to close down and lock down the country. I mean, which is a ridiculous notion anyway. You've got 75% of the population, the urban population, works in the informal sector. So if they don't work, they don't eat. So you can't. It's a lockdown is a completely impossible situation. The right wing has continued. The opposition continues to. The far right continue. They call Arce a dictator. I mean, it's not really clear how you can make that argument since the elections were declared free and honest by every group of international observers who took a look at it. But they continue to call him a dictator, a tyrant, and that he's doing everything to turn Bolivia into another Venezuela and Cuba. They did have an issue in October where they managed to mobilize a large number of people because, once again, they took a government law, and this has happened several times in Bolivian context, a law that was actually designed to control money laundering. And so Bolivia would meet international standards around money laundering and manipulate it into convincing, in fact, those informal workers who were all organized in unions, convince them that the government would be investigating their bank accounts and so on and so forth. So there was popular protest, and the right wing took advantage of it and really shaped the narrative. And the Arce government had to basically ended up abandoning the law. But overall, I think they're doing. It's rocky. And there's always the fear, I think, that particularly people in the MAS and around the MAS are very understandably very sensitive about any indication that anyone might try and pull off a coup again. But but I would say overall they've done a very good job in the last year.
And I'll keep it short.
Add to that. Please, no, please.
Yeah, so folks can ask questions. So I'll say that. So I was here during the elections last year, and I spoke with folks on left, right, politicians everywhere, and folks, social movements. But I remember I was with the ex-president Lugo of Paraguay, and some politicians from Peru that were part of Castillo's party, and they said that these are the most important elections for Latin America of this decade, because this is really going to, at the end of the day, this is the blueprint, and this is going to see whether people are going to accept these kinds of illegal transfers of power or not. And I think resoundingly, obviously, the Bolivians voted, no, we don't want this anymore. But it really has become the blueprint, and it's become the kind of new form of coup, as what Linda said, the coup light, or dicta suave, sometimes folks say. And as I mentioned, it happened in Haiti, Brazil. They use these constitutional means. You can't get away with what you did before. But what you can do is say, wow, that seems, there's some corruption there. That seems not constitutional, and throw a bunch of dust up in the air. And then really at the end of the day, put a bunch of memes on Facebook or information. I mean, if people are getting their information more so through social media than actual facts, it's really not that hard. And we know this, it's happening in the United States. I mean, this is not, as Linda said, it's just like, it's nothing new.